Most people never get a second chance to do the right thing at the right moment. The universe rarely lines up that perfectly. But, every once in a while, a stranger appears at the exact moment you least expect it, in the exact place you never planned to be, and everything about that encounter feels heavier than coincidence. It feels like something older than luck. Something that was always waiting for you to show up. This is not a story about magic, though some people who hear it call it that. It is not a story about religion, though it carries more spiritual weight than most sermons ever will. It is a story about one ordinary man who stopped when everyone else would have kept walking and, in doing so, accidentally walked through a door that hadn't been opened to an outsider in over 100 years. Pay attention. Because the most important moments in life never announce themselves. The summer of 2009 was brutal in the White Mountains of eastern Arizona. The kind of heat that doesn't just sit on your skin, it presses down into your bones and makes you feel like the earth itself is angry at you for being there. Caleb Merritt was not the kind of man who sought out discomfort. He was 34 years old, a civil engineer from Flagstaff, a quiet man who liked order and straight lines and problems that had one correct answer. He had driven out that Saturday morning not for any grand reason but simply because his apartment had felt too small and his thoughts had felt too loud. He packed a water bottle, a granola bar, and his old hiking boots, and he drove east on Highway 260 without a real destination in mind. He pulled off onto a dirt road he didn't know the name of somewhere past the town of White River, which sits within the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, home of the White Mountain Apache tribe. He wasn't thinking about where he was in any deep sense. He wasn't thinking about whose land he was standing on or what kind of history had soaked into the soil beneath his boots. He was just a man trying to get some air, trying to walk until his head felt quieter. He had been on the trail for maybe 40 minutes when he heard it. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even loud, really. It was a sound somewhere between a moan and a sharp exhale, the kind of sound a person makes when they are in serious pain but are too proud or too afraid to let it all the way out. It came from somewhere below the ridge line to his left, down through a thick tangle of juniper and scrub oak. He stopped walking. He stood still for a moment and told himself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe. He started walking again. He heard it a second time. Caleb was not a hero. He would tell you that himself, and he would mean it. But he was the kind of man who, when faced with a clear choice between doing something and doing nothing, found that doing nothing sat wrong in his chest in a way he couldn't ignore. So he pushed through the brush, down the slope, stumbling a little on loose rocks, grabbing at branches to slow himself. He found her at the bottom of a shallow ravine. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, though it was difficult to be certain. She was Apache, with deep brown skin weathered by decades of sun, silver-black hair that had come loose from its braid, and dark eyes that were sharp even through the obvious pain she was in. She was sitting with her back against a large flat boulder, her right leg stretched out in front of her at an angle that told Caleb immediately something was wrong. Her ankle was swollen, already purpling above the top of her moccasin. There was a woven basket tipped over nearby, and what looked like dried plants and small tied bundles of herbs scattered across the ground around her. She looked at him when he came down the slope. She didn't look afraid. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you're not sure yet if they're useful or just another complication. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Caleb said, and immediately felt stupid for asking something so obvious. She said something in Apache. He didn't understand a single word of it, but the tone was clear enough. It was not a request for help. It was closer to a statement of fact. Like she was explaining his situation to him rather than asking him to fix it. He crouched down a few feet away, keeping his distance, trying to show her he wasn't going to crowd her. "I don't speak Apache," he said, feeling another wave of stupidity wash over him. "But I can see your ankle is hurt. Can I help you get up to the trail? Do you have a car? Someone I can call?" She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then, she said, in English that was clear and precise and carried no apology in it, "My name is Naki. You are on my family's land." Caleb blinked. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "I can leave if I didn't say leave," she said. "I said you are on my family's land." There was a pause. Help me stand. He moved closer carefully, the way you approach a situation when you're aware you don't fully understand it. He offered her his arm and she took it with a grip that was surprisingly strong. She was heavier than she looked, not in weight, but in presence, as if she occupied more space than her physical body actually took up. Together they managed to get her upright. She kept her weight off the right ankle, testing the left one, deciding it would hold. My truck, she said. Half-mile east. So they walked. It was slow. She used a twisted juniper branch as a makeshift staff and Caleb stayed close on her right side, ready to catch her if she stumbled. She didn't stumble. She moved through the brush like someone who had been moving through it her entire life, injured ankle and all, taking each step with an economy of motion that came from deep familiarity with this land. He, on the other hand, tripped twice on routes he should have seen coming. She didn't comment on this. But he had the feeling she noticed everything. They didn't talk much as they walked. He told her his name. She acknowledged it with a small nod but didn't repeat it. She asked him once why he was out here, and he gave her his honest answer: he needed space, needed to walk, hadn't had any particular plan. She nodded again at that, as though this answer meant something to her beyond its surface meaning, though he couldn't have said what. Her truck was an old red Ford, dusty and dented in a way that suggested it was used hard and maintained faithfully. She handed him the keys without hesitation and told him she would direct him. He drove slowly down the dirt road, following her quiet instructions: left here, right at the big pine, follow the fence line until they came out onto a paved road he didn't recognize. There's a clinic in White River, he offered. I know where the clinic is, she said. Take me home. He took her home. The house was modest, set back from the road, surrounded by a low fence strung with something he couldn't identify from the truck: small objects, woven things, bundles of dried material. There was a garden on the south side, dense and serious-looking, full of plants he couldn't name. A wooden porch ran across the front of the house. 2 chairs sat on it, one of which had a folded blanket over the arm like someone had been sitting there recently. He helped her out of the truck and up the porch steps. She unlocked the door herself and then turned to look at him before going inside. You'll come in, she said. It was not quite a question. Something in Caleb told him he should probably say no thank you and get back to his car. His car was still half a mile back up a dirt road. That was the more immediate problem. My car is back on the trail, he said. I know, she said. Come in. He came in. The inside of the house was dim and cool and smelled like cedar and something earthy he couldn't name. There were shelves along one wall lined with ceramic jars and glass bottles, with bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling above them. The walls had photographs, old ones, black and white, and newer color ones, of people and places. There were baskets, some functional and some clearly ceremonial. There was a wood stove and a kitchen and a table with 4 chairs. It looked like a home where a person actually lived, not a display. She lowered herself carefully into one of the kitchen chairs and pointed at the one across from her. Sit, she said. Caleb sat. She looked at him again with those measuring eyes. She had been looking at him since the moment he came down the slope, he realized, but each time it felt slightly different, like she was checking something new each time, running him through some internal assessment he wasn't aware of being part of. You stopped, she said. Of course I stopped, he said. Not everyone stops, she said. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. This turned out to be the right choice. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, my ankle will be fine. I've had worse. A pause. I was gathering medicine plants. I go every year at this time. I've been doing it since I was a girl. Another pause, longer this time. My daughter was supposed to come with me this year. She didn't. The flatness in those last 3 words carried more grief than a paragraph of explanation could have managed. Caleb understood without asking that the daughter's absence was not a simple logistical failure. Something had happened. Something heavy. He didn't press. Is there anyone I should call for you? He said. Family? A neighbor? She shook her head once, definitively. Then, let me look at the ankle before I go, he said. I have basic first aid. I'm not a doctor, but I can at least wrap it. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door opens that has been shut for a long time and needs a moment to move. There's a box, she said, under the sink. He found the first aid kit. He knelt on the kitchen floor and wrapped her ankle carefully while she sat straight-backed in the chair, looking at the wall above his head. He worked slowly and steadily, the way he approached everything, making sure it was done right. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked up at her. She was looking at him now. Directly. Fully. With an expression he had no framework for. You did that carefully, she said. It's a bad sprain, he said. You should stay off it. Yes, she said. And then, after a silence that felt weighted with something he couldn't yet name, my people have a word for what you did today. Coming down that slope. Stopping. She paused. It isn't a common word. We don't use it for small things. Caleb waited. You should come back, she said. Next Saturday. Come to the house. I'd sure, he said, a little surprised. Is there something you need? I can just come, she said. He nodded. She told him she would have her neighbor drive him back to his car. As he stood on the porch waiting, he looked out at the fence line with its small hanging objects, and, for the first time, he noticed how deliberately they were arranged. Not randomly, not casually. Each bundle and woven piece had a specific position. Like they were holding something in place. He didn't know yet what any of it meant. He didn't know yet that the conversation he just had in that kitchen was not just a conversation. He didn't know that Naki had been watching the land for someone to come down that slope for 3 years. He didn't know that in the Apache tradition she carried a tradition her own grandmother had passed to her in fragments and whispers. What he had just done had a name, and a meaning, and a weight that went back further than any record he could have found in any library. He just thought he'd helped a woman with a hurt ankle. He got in the neighbor's truck and rode back to his car as the sun went low and red over the mountains. He thought about the house. The plants on the shelves. The measuring eyes. He told himself he probably wouldn't go back. He went back. The following Saturday, Caleb drove back to the reservation with no real plan. He told himself he was just checking on her ankle. He told himself it was a simple thing, a courtesy call, the kind of follow-up any decent person would make. He brought nothing with him because he didn't know what to bring. He knocked on the door of the house with the wooden porch and the fence strung with hanging bundles, and he waited. Naki answered the door without surprise, as though she had looked out the window 10 seconds before and confirmed to herself that yes, he was coming up the path, exactly as expected. She was moving better. The ankle was wrapped in something, not his bandage, but a cloth that smelled strongly of something herbal and sharp. She didn't use a cane. She looked him up and down once, the same measuring examination she had performed in the ravine and the kitchen and on the porch. Then, she stepped back from the doorway. Good, she said. Come. There was coffee on the table. 2 cups. He noticed that, and didn't say anything about it. They sat across from each other in the same chairs as before. She asked him about his work and he explained what civil engineers did, and she listened in a way that most people don't listen, with her whole attention, without thinking about what she was going to say next. When he finished, she nodded as though civil engineering confirmed something she had already suspected about him. You build things, she said. Bridges. Roads. Things that hold other things up. Basically, yes. Good, she said again, in that same tone, as if this were a box being checked. He asked about her ankle. She told him it was healing and that the poultice she'd applied was something her grandmother taught her, made from plants she had gathered herself over many years, and it worked better than anything a clinic would give her. She said this without arrogance. She said it the way a person states a fact they have tested personally 100 times. He asked her, carefully, about the plants on her shelves. She glanced at the shells and, then, back at him. You want to know what they are? I'm curious, he said. You don't have to tell me. She studied him for a moment. Most people who come into this house, if they ever do, look at those shelves like they're looking at something strange. Like it's a curiosity. She paused. You looked at them last week like you were trying to understand them. He thought about that. I guess I was, he said. She got up carefully, favoring the left leg still, and moved to the shelves. She began to point and name. Not the English names, though she gave those too when she had them, but first the Apache names, each word landing in the room with a distinctness that made him feel the language had been built specifically to describe these things. She showed him the dried stalks of a plant she used for joint pain. A bundle of something dark and brittle that, when rubbed between the fingers and held near the nose, smelled ancient and forested in a way that made his chest do something unexpected. Small ceramic jars of powder he couldn't identify. A bundle of feathers from a bird she named in Apache first, then translated eagle. The tail feathers. Very old. My grandmother's grandmother gathered these. She said it all plainly. Not performing anything, not mystifying anything. Just telling him. He listened. He asked questions only when something wasn't clear, and she answered each one the same way, directly, without dressing the information up or dumbing it down. At some point he realized he had been sitting in that kitchen for nearly 3 hours. The light through the windows had changed. Before he left, she asked him to come the following Saturday. He came. This became a pattern over the next 6 weeks. Every Saturday, he drove out from Flagstaff. Every Saturday, she had coffee ready. Every Saturday, she showed him or told him something, or asked him something, or sat with him in a silence that was more comfortable each week. He learned that she had been born in a camp in the mountains during winter. That she had gone to a federal Indian boarding school as a girl and had spent years learning to hold 2 entirely separate versions of herself simultaneously, the version the school wanted and the version her grandmother was quietly, carefully, illegally building in her alongside it. That her husband had died 19 years ago. That her daughter, the one who had not come to gather medicine plants, had moved to Phoenix and had not spoken to her mother in 3 years because of a disagreement that Naki described in 2 sentences and, then, did not discuss further. She learned things about him too. That his parents had divorced when he was 11 and that he had grown up in the gap between 2 households, belonging fully to neither. That he had almost quit engineering school in his 2nd year and had stayed only because a professor had told him he had a rare ability to see systems, to look at a complex structure and feel where it was stressed, where it was about to fail. That he had never been married. That he had one close friend, a man named Terry, who was more brother than friend, and that outside of Terry his social world was thin. She listened to all of this with the same quality of attention she gave to everything. On the 7th Saturday, something was different. When he arrived, there were 3 other people on the porch. 2 women, one older, perhaps Naki's age, and one younger, maybe 30, and a man who looked to be in his 50s, broad and quiet, with the kind of stillness in him that didn't feel passive but rather deeply settled, like a post that's been driven down to bedrock. They were all Apache. They all looked at him when he came up the path. Naki introduced him. She used his name, which she had never done before in front of others. She introduced the older woman as her cousin Ruth. The younger woman was Ruth's granddaughter, Sarah. The man was named Joseph. She did not explain why they were there or what they were there for. She brought more coffee and they all sat on the porch and talked about the weather, about some construction project happening near White River, about a ceremony that was coming up in the fall that several families were preparing for. Caleb sat with them and listened and spoke when spoken to. He tried not to feel like a variable that had been introduced into an equation without explanation. He was not always successful. At one point Joseph, who had barely spoken, turned to look at him directly and said, "She says you came down the slope." It was such a specific way of putting it that Caleb paused before answering. "I heard her. From the trail. I came down to see if she needed help." Joseph nodded slowly, the way men nod when they are confirming something to themselves rather than responding to the person who spoke. "Most people don't," Joseph said. They hear something, they walk faster. They tell themselves it was nothing. He looked at Caleb without hostility, without warmth exactly, but with a kind of serious attention. You didn't. No, Caleb said. Joseph nodded again and looked back out at the yard. That evening, after the others had gone, Naki sat across from Caleb at the kitchen table for the last time that summer with the familiar coffee and the familiar silence, and told him something that rearranged his understanding of everything that had happened since July. She told him that what he had done in the ravine had a name. She told him that her people, and she meant specifically the tradition she carried, a thread of practice and knowledge passed through the women of her family across generations, had a concept for the kind of act he had performed. Not the physical act of helping a hurt person. Any decent stranger could do that. But the specific quality of it. The way he had come down the slope not knowing what he would find, not calculating whether it was safe or convenient, not performing concern but simply responding to a sound with the same directness that an animal moves toward water when it is thirsty. That quality of response, that unrehearsed, uncalculated movement toward need, had a name in her language that translated into English as something close to the one who walks toward, but was in reality much larger and more specific than those words conveyed. She told him it was rare. She told him it was the quality that, in the old tradition her family kept, identified the person who could receive a certain kind of knowledge. Not a shaman. Not a healer. Something older and less defined than those words, something that the English language didn't have a clean translation for. More like a keeper. A person who holds something so it isn't lost. Caleb sat with this for a long time. He was an engineer. He liked straight lines. He was not a man who reached easily for the mystical or the metaphorical. What are you saying to me, exactly, he said. I'm saying, Naki told him, that the 3 people who were here today came to look at you. And they agree with me. Agree about what? That you are the right kind of person. He looked at her. Right for what? She was quiet for a moment. The house was very still around them. Outside the window the last light was going golden and long through the juniper trees. My daughter was supposed to receive what I carry, she said. She will not. That door is closed. There was no self-pity in it. The knowledge I have, the things my grandmother gave me and her grandmother gave her, they cannot die with me. They have to go somewhere. Into someone. She paused. In the old way, in the way that is almost completely gone now, there was a process for when the natural line was broken. When the person who should receive it cannot or will not. There was a process for finding the right person outside the family. Outside the tribe. She looked at him steadily across the table. You have been in that process since the day you came down the slope, she said. The words landed in Caleb's chest with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to the quiet way she had said them. He felt suddenly, acutely aware of every Saturday he had spent in this house. Every cup of coffee. Every question he had asked about the plants on the shelf. Every silence he had sat in without trying to fill it. Every moment that had felt like just a conversation and was apparently, simultaneously, something else entirely. The gathering trip, he said slowly. The day I found you, she looked at him and said nothing, which was its own answer. Were you in as much pain as you looked? A pause. My ankle was genuinely hurt, she said. I did not plan to fall. But, and here something moved across her face that was close to the first real smile he had seen from her, small and private and completely honest. I had been going to that place for 3 years. Hoping the right person might come down the slope. Caleb sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the old photographs on the wall, the faces of people he didn't know who were connected by blood and time and tradition to the woman sitting across from him. What does this process involve? He asked finally. A year, she said. Maybe more. Coming here. Learning. Not just the plants and the methods. The way of seeing that holds it all together. She paused. It is not a small thing I'm offering you. I want you to understand that. I understand that, he said. And he did. It will also not be what you expect, she added. It will not feel like studying. It won't be a lesson you can write down and keep. It works differently than that. He was quiet for a while. The engineer in him wanted a flowchart. A set of defined inputs and outputs. A clear deliverable at the end. The other part of him, the part that had come down a slope toward an unknown sound because it was the only thing he could do, already knew he was going to say yes. What if I'm not good enough at it, he said. Naki looked at him across the kitchen table with those dark, measuring, ancient eyes. That is the right question, she said. It means you're already further along than most people ever get. Outside the window, the sun finished setting over the white mountains. Inside the house, two people sat across a kitchen table, on either side of a threshold that most people never even get to see, let alone stand before. Caleb said yes. He had no idea what he had just agreed to. He would spend the next 14 months finding out. The first thing Naki taught him was how to be quiet. Not quiet the way a polite person is quiet when someone else is talking. Not the practiced, performative silence of a man who has learned that listening looks a certain way. She meant quiet in a much older and, more demanding sense, the absence of the constant internal narration that most people maintain from the moment they wake up until the moment they fall asleep. The running commentary on what they're seeing, what they think about it, whether it confirms or contradicts what they already believed. That noise. She wanted that gone. She did not explain this in one conversation. She demonstrated it, over many weeks, through a series of exercises that Caleb initially did not realize were exercises at all. She would send him out into the land behind the house and tell him to sit at a specific spot until she called him back. Sometimes that was 20 minutes. Sometimes it was 3 hours. She never told him in advance how long it would be. The first few times, he sat with his thoughts chattering at him like a room full of strangers, and he came back feeling vaguely defeated without being able to say why. She would look at him when he returned and know immediately how it had gone, with an accuracy that unsettled him. Your body comes back clean, she told him once, but your face still has all the noise in it. He started to understand over time that she was teaching him to receive information differently. Not through analysis, not through categorization, not through the sorting and labeling mechanisms that had made him a good engineer, but that were, in this context, entirely in the way. The land had a language. The plants had a language. The quality of the light in a specific hour at a specific season was information if you could receive it without immediately converting it into something you already knew how to name. She had been trained in this skill since childhood. He was 34, and every professional instinct he had worked against him. He failed at it repeatedly. Completely. Sometimes embarrassingly. There was a morning in December, 4 months in, when she took him on a gathering walk and he confidently identified a plant he was certain he had seen her point to before and was wrong, and was corrected in 2 quiet words that landed worse than a shout would have. He stood in the cold mountain air feeling the specific humiliation of a man who was skilled in one domain discovering that skill transfers to nothing in a new one. He wanted to be good at this. He wanted to be useful. He wanted, if he was being deeply honest, to be worth the trust she was extending to him. Naki watched him stand there with his wrong plant and his bruised competence and, she said, good. You made that mistake now instead of later. Now it's gone. That was her approach to his errors. They happened, they were noted without ceremony, and they were expected to be over. No lingering. No apology sessions. No discussion of what it meant about him as a person. Wrong was wrong, correction was swift, and the path continued. He found this, over time, more genuinely compassionate than most of the softer handling he'd received from teachers in his life. Joseph became a presence in this year too. He showed up at the house on certain Saturdays in what felt like a pattern Caleb couldn't decode, and, when he was there, the nature of the teaching changed. Where Naki taught him through plants and land and quiet, Joseph taught him through story. Apache oral tradition carried enormous amounts of information in its narratives, not parables in the simplified Western sense, not stories with a single extractable moral, but layered accounts in which the same story revealed different things at different points in a listener's development. Joseph would tell a story once. He wouldn't explain it. Weeks later he might tell the same story again and Caleb would notice he was hearing things in it that had been entirely invisible to him the first time. He began keeping a journal, not at anyone's instruction, just because the volume of things he was experiencing had outgrown his ability to hold them all in his head. He filled 3 notebooks over the course of that 14 months. Looking back at them later, he could trace something in the entries that he had not been able to see while he was living it, a gradual change in how he thought and what he noticed. The early entries were full of observation, detailed, precise, well-organized accounts of what had happened and what had been shown to him. The later entries were different. Less systematic. More patient. He would write about a single moment, the smell of a plant, the quality of Joseph's voice when he spoke a certain phrase in Apache, the light through Naki's window on a winter morning, and give it as much space as a whole day used to get. He became different at his job, too, in ways his colleague Terry noticed before Caleb did. Slower in the good sense. More willing to sit with a problem before reaching for a solution. His boss commented that he had developed an unusual ability to catch systemic issues early, before they reached the crisis stage. Caleb knew, though he didn't say it to anyone, that this was related to what he was learning in the White Mountains every Saturday, this practice of receiving information without immediately domesticating it, of letting a thing be what it was before deciding what to do about it. Ruth and Sarah visited several times. Ruth, he came to understand, held a similar role in her branch of the family as Naki did in hers. They were, in some sense, counterparts, and the tradition Caleb was being drawn into was not a single woman's personal practice but something woven through multiple family lines, a living network of knowledge that had survived boarding schools and forced relocation and 100 years of deliberate cultural erasure, specifically because it had been held by people like Naki and Ruth who understood how to keep it alive without making it visible. Sarah, Ruth's granddaughter, was in her own process a different one, for which she had been prepared from birth. Caleb and Sarah did not talk much at first, inhabiting separate tracks of the same larger thing. But, over the course of the year, a quiet mutual respect developed between them. She was training to be a healer in the specific medical tradition of her family. He was training to be something harder to name. One afternoon on the porch she tried to explain to him in English what the Apache word for his role roughly meant. "The closest I can get," she said, "is maybe a place where something lives that would otherwise have nowhere to go." She paused, looking for a better translation. "Like a seed bank. But the seeds are alive. And you're not storing them, exactly. They're growing in you. And, eventually, through you, into someone else." He thought about that for a long time. 14 months after he had first come down that slope in the White Mountains, Naki told him it was time for the final part of the process. She told him this in October, in the kitchen, over coffee, in exactly the same matter-of-fact voice she used for everything. He had learned by then not to ask what this meant specifically, because half the time she wouldn't answer and the other half his question would reveal something he needed to examine in himself before he was ready to hear her answer. So he said okay, and she said to come the following Saturday, and to come alone, and to arrive at dawn. He arrived at dawn. What happened that morning took 4 hours. Caleb has never given a complete account of it to anyone outside the tradition and does not plan to. Not because he was told to keep it secret, exactly, but because he found, when he tried to describe it to Terry afterward in even rough terms, that the words he reached for were so inadequate that using them would misrepresent the experience so completely as to become a kind of lie. Some things are not built for verbal transfer. This is, in fact, part of the point. What he will say, and has said in the one interview he agreed to give years later, is that the morning involved all 4 of them, Naki, Ruth, Sarah, and Joseph, and that it was conducted in the Apache language except for the moments when Naki spoke to him directly in English. That there were songs. That there were objects passed and names spoken and a specific sequence of events that had not changed in its essential form for well over a century. That the last thing Naki said to him, at the end, was not a blessing or a declaration or a graduation speech. It was a question. A single question, in Apache, which Sarah whispered a translation of into his ear, and which he answered, and which he still thinks about regularly more than a decade later. He drove back to Flagstaff that afternoon feeling not elevated or mystical or transformed in the dramatic sense the word usually implies. He felt heavier. Not in a bad way. In the way a load-bearing wall feels heavier than a decorative one. He had been given something to hold, and the weight of it was real and ongoing, and he understood now that it would be with him for the rest of his life. Naki lived for 6 more years after that October morning. Caleb drove to White River almost every month during that time, maintaining the relationship, continuing to learn, sitting in the kitchen with coffee. She slowed down gradually and, with enormous dignity, the way a great tree slows, not diminished, just stilling. She died in the spring of 2016, at home, with family present. Caleb was not there when she passed, but Sarah called him that evening and he sat on his apartment floor in Flagstaff for a long time without doing much of anything. He has worked, in the years since, with Sarah and Ruth. Ruth is elderly now but still present, still sharp, to ensure that what he carries has been properly integrated into the living tradition rather than isolated in him. He is not a teacher of Apache culture and makes no claim to that role. He has attended ceremonies as an invited guest. He has, on 2 occasions, been part of conversations with younger Apache people who were themselves entering processes of learning and inheritance, not as a figure of authority but as a man who could speak honestly to the experience of receiving something enormous and trying to hold it without crushing it. He is in his 50s now. He still works as a civil engineer. He still lives in Flagstaff. He still goes out to walk in the mountains when his apartment feels too small and his thoughts feel too loud, though the quality of those walks has changed in ways that are difficult to put cleanly into English. People who know him well, and Terry is one of the few who knows even part of the full story, describe him as someone who has a strange quality of unhurried attention. He is the kind of person you find yourself telling things to before you meant to. He is the kind of person who, when something in a room goes wrong, moves toward it rather than away from it. He came down a slope in the summer of 2009 because he heard a sound that needed a response, and did not stop to calculate whether it was worth it. He has been carrying the consequences of that unrehearsed decency ever since. He does not call it a burden. He is careful about this. There is a word Naki taught him, in the long middle months of that 14-month year, that he returns to more than almost anything else she gave him. It doesn't translate cleanly into English. The best approximation she ever offered was something like, the right weight, carried by the right person, carried in the right way. She told him that in her family's tradition, this was considered the highest possible outcome for a life. Not achievement in the usual sense. Not recognition. Not even happiness, exactly. Just that, the right weight, the right person, carried correctly. He thought about this while she was teaching him, and he has continued to think about it in every year since. He has no way of knowing for certain if he is the right person. He cannot verify it against any external standard. What he knows is that the weight is real, and that he has not put it down, and that something in him, the same instinct that sent him down a rocky slope toward an unknown sound on a brutally hot Arizona Saturday, tells him that carrying it is the most important thing he has ever done and will ever do. That is enough. Naki told him once that in the old way, enough was considered a very great thing. Not a small thing dressed up as acceptance. A genuinely great thing. Most people, she told him, spend their entire lives chasing more and never once arrive at enough. Caleb Merritt arrived there on a hillside in the White Mountains, at the sound of a woman in pain, before he even knew the journey had started. He went down the slope. Everything else followed.